Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at how to warm up like a pro. This is the third in our series of the oxygen uptake kinetics, and we're going to be looking at priming exercise. Now when I say how to warm up like a pro, this is not going to be a cookbook of how to actually do warming up. What we're going to look at is a specific type of warm up that we developed as a result of our research. Now athletes, of course, for any event or race will perform a warm-up, and those warm-ups will vary depending on the demands of the task itself. And you can see here Team Sky warming up before an event. And when we started all of this, we weren't really interested in warming up at all. We were interested in how the oxygen uptake response occurred and what was limiting that. It was only subsequently that we started looking at whether or not the information we were gleaning from that could be applied to warm-up exercise. So what I'd like to do in this session is take you on that journey and ultimately end with a recommendation, and only a recommendation, for how you might want to warm up under certain conditions. And where this all started was with our understanding of the heavy intensity exercise response. As an undergraduate, I really got interested in this aspect of physiology. And to remind you of where we've got to in the series so far, here we have the oxygen uptake response to heavy exercise with its three phases: the cardiodynamic phase, phase 1, phase 2, the primary component, and then phase 3, this slow component which drives oxygen uptake above rather than towards the anticipated steady state value. We also mentioned the oxygen deficit phase, which is where the energy for the task is coming from anaerobic sources, or more accurately from substrate level phosphorylation. Now I got interested in oxygen uptake kinetics because I was a triathlete at the time, and I really wanted to understand what happened when you transitioned from swimming to cycling to running. So that transition between exercise modalities always feels really weird. So that's what I was really trying to study, was what was going on there. And in doing the research for that, I came across a seam of literature that looked at the effect of prior exercise on subsequent exercise responses in the same exercise modality. And so I wanted to take that on and see if I could do that in different modalities. And one of the key papers published in this area was by Gabino et al. In 1996, some 25 years ago. And what these authors did, Anthony Gabino was a medical student who was doing a project in the middle of his medical degree, so he wasn't doing a series of studies. This is the only one he did. But within this, they looked at prior moderate exercise, followed by moderate exercise, prior heavy exercise, followed by moderate exercise, and then 2 bouts of heavy exercise together. And the only condition in which they found anything changed was in the repeated bouts of heavy intensity exercise. So prior moderate exercise did not affect subsequent moderate exercise, prior moderate exercise did not affect subsequent heavy exercise, and prior heavy exercise did not affect subsequent moderate exercise. What they did find, though, was there was a significant effect on the VO2 response if you performed repeated bouts of heavy exercise. So here we have 1 bout above the lactate threshold, 6 minutes recovery, and then another 6 minutes bout of heavy intensity exercise. And you can see that the VO2 kinetics appear to be speeded in the second bout of exercise. You have VO2 rising more rapidly to the same level, and you can also see the area above the curve, what we would call the oxygen deficit, is also smaller in the second bout than in the first bout. Now this was performed in the context of an intense debate about what determined the VO2 kinetics at the time. Was it an oxygen delivery limitation, or was it a metabolic inertia, something going on inside the muscle that was leading to the slowing of those, or how slow the kinetics were, the fact that it was delayed in rising? And what Gabino et al. Concluded was that because they were performing exercise above the lactate threshold, and that was the only one that was effective, they were arguing that there was an oxygen delivery limitation in the first bout of exercise that was alleviated to some extent in the second bout of exercise. They reasoned this because this prior exercise elevated blood lactate concentration, and 6 minutes was not long enough for blood lactate to return to baseline, so it's still elevated to about 5 millimoles per litre here. And as a consequence, the lactate would have increased blood flow to the muscle. It would also have increased or at least the pH drop associated with that, would also have increased oxygen unloading in the muscle, and therefore would have released some of the limitation wrought by this oxygen delivery limitation in the first bout of exercise, and that explained the speeding of the response. A subsequent paper by McDonald et al. In Richard Houston's lab concluded exactly the same thing, and both of these papers together were very influential in suggesting that there was an oxygen delivery limitation exclusively to exercise above the lactate threshold. Then I started my PhD alongside Andy Jones and Joe Doust, Helen Carter and Craig Williams, and we said, hang on a second, it's maybe not that simple, because Gabino et al. Simply applied a single curve to the entire oxygen uptake response. So the speeding of the kinetics was based on fitting a single curve to a three-phase response. So what would happen if you isolated the primary phase? Remember last week I said if you don't isolate the primary phase, the slow component can have a very significant impact on your measurement of the VO2 kinetics. And so what we did was we repeated Gabino's study, and I'm going to focus on the heavy intensity exercise. So we can show a speeding of the oxygen uptake kinetics by doing exactly the same curve fitting as them. And so here you have a mono-exponential function applied to heavy exercise, and you have a time constant of 53 seconds in that particular case. Then you wait a period of time and you perform another bout of exercise. In this particular case we had 10 minutes of recovery for reasons I won't go into, and this is what you find. So here's the second bout of exercise, and you can see, yes, oxygen uptake does seem to rise faster. You get a shorter time constant compared to the first bout, so a significant speeding of the VO2 kinetics. But remember, we're applying a single curve here to three phases. What we want to do is isolate the key kinetic phase, and that's the primary phase. And there's various ways of doing that I explained last week, but what I'm going to do is just look at a single curve fit to the primary component in the next slide. Because when you do that, the primary component in the first bout of exercise in this participant was 21 seconds, and in the second bout 29 seconds. And on average there was no difference when we measured this between the first bout and the second bout in terms of the kinetics of oxygen uptake. In other words, the primary VO2 kinetics are not speeded by prior heavy exercise. Instead, what you can see happening is the primary amplitude appears to be elevated, and you can see the difference in the size of the slow component. It is much smaller in the second bout of exercise. Now this was something that Gabino et al. Detected, and we obviously repeated that, as did McDonald et al. But the slow component isn't smaller because you've got a speeding of the VO2 kinetics. The slow component appears to be smaller because you have an elevated primary component. And this, if you like, is the classic picture of primed exercise. So I would argue the classical priming effect is this one. If you start a bout of exercise with an elevated baseline blood lactate concentration, that is the white symbols you see here, you will see an increase in the primary amplitude and a reduction in the amplitude of the slow component compared to the first bout of exercise. That's the classic priming effect. Why is this of any interest to performance though? Well, when we did our latter studies in my PhD up at Manchester Metropolitan with Andy Jones, we increased the intensity of our priming bouts for reasons of trying to maximize the possible effects. And in doing so, we got to a point where 6 minutes was barely achievable in the first bout of exercise. Participants had real difficulty getting to that point. And then we performed exactly the same bout of exercise 12 minutes later. So that was our second bout of exercise, and that's what you're seeing here. And in that second bout of exercise, participants were much more capable of getting to 6 minutes. And Andy Jones, when he performed the trial, he was one of those who really struggled to get to 6 minutes, but had absolutely no difficulty whatsoever getting to 6 minutes in the second bout of exercise. So for whatever reason, participants were reporting that the priming effect is such that the second bout hits you harder. It's harder to get on top of things, but once you're there, it's easier to maintain it. And this opened our eyes to the fact there could be some performance enhancement here. And so what we did was we performed a series of experiments to try and tease that out. The first was Darrell Wilkerson's master's thesis, which we published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. And what we did in that one was look at 3 bouts of exercise, one at 100% VO2 peak, another at 110, and another at 120. And what we did was we performed 6 minutes of prior exercise and then one of those bouts, or we performed no warm-up whatsoever. So the black bars here, that's no warm-up, and the white bars are the priming warm-up, so the 6 minutes of prior heavy exercise. And what we showed was the increase in time to task failure was somewhere between 30 and 60% compared to the control condition. So a very substantial improvement in performance compared to doing nothing. Now, of course, funnily enough, no athlete does nothing before performance. They will all warm up in some way. So what we needed to do was look at whether or not priming exercise was beneficial in relation to other types of warm-up. And that was our next study. We did this in Aberystwyth, and we had 3 conditions. So we had prior moderate exercise, prior heavy exercise for the same total exercise volume, so the same energy expenditure in the heavy exercises than the moderate exercise, so the moderate exercise lasted longer. And we also performed a Wingate sprint, 10 minutes of recovery, and then we performed a 7-minute performance trial, which involved 2 minutes of exercise at a constant load, so we could monitor the primary VO2 kinetics, and then 5 minutes all out, so the participants were trying to maximize power output throughout this 5-minute test phase, so essentially a time trial lasting 5 minutes. Take a blood sample before and after so we can actually measure whether the exercise is primed or not, and then we measured the change in performance compared to doing nothing. And so in this next slide we're going to see each condition compared to doing nothing. And so the black symbols are the moderate exercise, white symbols are the heavy exercise, and then the downward black triangles, that's the Wingate sprint. And you can see that both prior moderate exercise and prior heavy exercise on average improve performance substantially by about 2 to 3%. The prior sprint exercise, the Wingate, the results were a lot more variable. Most people didn't perform as well as you might expect, but there were some people, even after a 30-second sprint, performed better than doing no warm-up whatsoever. And the people who performed best in the heavy intensity exercise weren't necessarily also the people that performed best in the moderate exercise. So in a sense, from an individual athlete perspective, priming is worth a try because it may be that it's a better option than doing prior moderate exercise, and usually certainly a better option than doing prior sprint exercise. The other advantage of priming exercise is you have an easy marker of its impact and its effect. So you can take a blood lactate measurement and work out whether or not you are primed, something you can't do with prior moderate exercise. And what you want to be doing is trying to elevate blood lactate somewhere between 2 and 5 millimoles per litre, but 2 to 3 millimoles per litre is probably optimal from what we've seen in previous studies. And this was very interesting. So what we've got here is this is the kind of intensity you want to be doing, either prior moderate or prior heavy exercise with a moderate elevation in blood lactate. Okay, so that's that. Well, how long can you leave it before it has no effect? What's the recovery duration? What's the optimal duration of recovery? Stephen Bailey's looked at this in a bit more detail, but we started off by saying, well, simply how long does this effect last in terms of the oxygen uptake response? And so the next slides are going to show you that. And here's the oxygen uptake response after 10 minutes of recovery, so clearly a large priming effect. This is the second bout of exercise in the white symbols compared to the first, so clearly primed after 10 minutes. You also see an elevated baseline. That's because the oxygen uptake response hasn't recovered from the first bout. After 20 minutes of recovery, now we have a similar baseline, but we still have the priming effect on the primary amplitude and the slow component. After 30 minutes of recovery, again, we have recovery of baseline VO2, but we still see some elevation in the primary amplitude. After 45 minutes, it's still there, but it's difficult to see. And after 60 minutes, the oxygen uptake responses are essentially identical. So somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes is how long this priming effect lasts on the VO2 response. And that gives you quite a bit of flexibility in terms of how long you leave it between your warm-up or your priming and your race. And you might not necessarily have full control over that depending on the schedule of the events that you're working with. But typically 15 to 20 minutes is the kind of duration you want to be looking for in terms of the recovery between the warm-up or the priming and your race. And this led to some collaboration with the EIS. So Steve Ingham, Jamie Pringle and Barry Fudge had a chat with me in 2007. I was over in Loughborough for a research seminar, and they just wanted to have a chat with me about some of my research, and particularly the priming research, which had obviously appeared in the literature by that point. And they wanted to say, well, how would we be able to apply this in the athletes we're working with? And so I had a good long chat with them about that, and they then took it away and said to some of the coaches they were working with, here's a new performance enhancement method which may well work, should we try it out? And the coaches simply said to them, well, all the research has been done on cycling, we work with track athletes, 800 meter runners, 1500 meter runners, we are not interested unless you can show it really works in running. And so to their credit, the EIS guys said, well, okay, let's do that. And in collaboration again with Andy Jones, Steve and his team did a study in which they measured the effect of priming on performance in 800 meter runners in their programs. And what you see here is the data from that. So they essentially did either their normal warm-up, the con condition, or a heavy prior warm-up, so priming exercise. You can see with the normal warm-up, this is the average, or the speed for each 100 meter section across the group. And here's in the primed condition, the speed for that condition. And the interesting thing here for me is that the profile of the primed condition is almost identical to the way in which we felt about it when we first did some of the higher intensity work we were looking at, that the second half of the effort just for some reason feels easier and more, if you like, doable. And when you apply that to an athlete in a race situation, that is going to result in a higher speed. And there was a significant improvement in performance with this of, if memory serves me correctly, about 2 to 3 seconds in an 800 meter race. And as a consequence of that, the coaches suddenly bought in to this idea, and to this day priming exercise has been used by British athletics to enhance performance. And I'm very pleased to say this is a picture of an athlete winning a gold medal in a primed state. So the heptathletes in the program often use priming prior to the 800 meter run, for the very reason that Steve had already done the work. Steve and his team had done the work on this to prove, if prove is quite the right word, that this actually works in elite athletes. So, the burning question, how do you warm up like a pro? Well, first of all, we know that a high intensity warm-up may be beneficial in endurance events lasting somewhere between 2 and 30 minutes in duration. So what I'm saying there is severe intensity exercises where we think the effects are most likely to be seen. You might say priming exercise is probably not worth doing in a marathon for 2 reasons. First of all, we're talking about a race that's going to last significantly more than 2 hours, and what you don't necessarily want to do is a large volume of high intensity work before you then do something that's limited by your glycogen stores. But for severe intensity exercise where energy stores are not the limiting factor, it's probably a useful thing to try. You need to perform exercise above the lactate threshold, and you want an increase in blood lactate of about 2 to 5 millimoles per litre at the point you start your race. So it's obviously going to elevate more than that when you do your priming, but then it will recover down to about 2 to 3 millimoles per litre is probably optimal, but you could probably push it up to about 5 in some cases. In terms of recovery duration, you should be looking for about 15 to 20 minutes. This is work from Stephen Bailey, and his PhD with Andy Jones showed that was most likely the optimal, is about 20 minutes in duration, but the effects can last up to 45 minutes. So there is quite a bit of leeway in terms of priming should still be effective, even if you don't exactly get that recovery duration. The research we've done has typically used 6-minute bouts of exercise, which is essentially equivalent to doing a mile rep at race pace, would be the equivalent in the real world. But provided you elevate lactate in your priming bout, it doesn't really matter how you do it. So any warm-up procedure could be done that way. It could be constant load, it could be intervals, it could be bursts of high intensity activity as part of the warm-up you're doing. So you don't necessarily need to completely revolutionize or completely change the way in which you warm up. You could just tweak it so that you bring in a high intensity element. And the last thing to say is that you should build to a key race. So try this out in training first. If it seems to work for you, try it out in some low-key races. If it still works for you, then reflect on how you've done it and how it works in the real world, and then refine it, and then use it when it really matters, if it works for you. And that is the story of priming exercise and how you use some reasonably deep physiology to come to a conclusion that you never expected to in the first place, and that is how you warm up like some of the pros. Thank you very much for listening. Please don't forget to like and subscribe if you like my content, and I'll see you next time. Thank you very, very much for listening.